In the early years of the 19th century, a French confectioner named Nicolas Appert was working on a problem that did not look like the foundation of a new food system. It looked like a kitchen problem, a storage problem, a distance problem. Food spoiled, armies marched, cities grew, ships left port for months at a time. And once fresh food moved beyond the narrow window of harvest, slaughter, or local delivery, time started to destroy it. Appert's idea was simple enough to sound unimportant. Put food into a container, seal it, heat it, keep the outside world out. What he was trying to solve was immediate and practical. What he ended up touching was much larger. Because today, supermarket aisles, wartime ration systems, industrial food brands, emergency stockpiles, ocean freight, and the modern pantry all sit downstream of that same logic. Not the recipe, not the label, the logic. This is the story of how a cheap metal container became one of the quietest revolutions in modern life. The preservation method that made it possible, the manufacturing problems that nearly kept it small, the wars that turned it into strategic infrastructure, and how something as ordinary as a can changed the relationship between food, distance, time, and trust. Before canned food, the problem was not that people lacked ways to preserve food. They had many: salted meat, smoked fish, dried beans, hardtack, pickled vegetables, fermented foods, sugared fruit. Those methods were old, practical, and often effective, but they came with limits that became more serious as states, armies, and cities expanded. Salt and smoke changed texture and taste. Drying required the right conditions. Pickling worked for some foods and not for others. Fresh produce still remained seasonal. Meat still remained vulnerable. Dairy remained even worse. A town could live on what was near it. A port city could import some staples. A military column could drag rations with it. But reliable food at scale, across long distance over long time, was still fragile. That fragility mattered more than it sounds. An urban population does not merely need food, it needs predictable food. A navy does not merely need calories, it needs food that survives moisture, motion, and delay. A merchant does not merely need preserved goods, he needs stock that can be counted, shipped, stored, and sold without guessing how much will rot before it arrives. The real bottleneck was not farming, it was continuity. How do you keep food edible long enough to separate where it is produced from where it is consumed? That is the problem Appert was circling. In 1795, the French government had offered a prize for a method of preserving food for armies and navies. France was at war. Supply mattered. A nation could field soldiers, build ships, and still fail if it could not feed men at a distance. Appert, working without the benefit of modern germ theory, discovered something operationally profound before science had fully explained why it worked. Food sealed in a container and heated properly could remain preserved far longer than convention had any right to expect. He began with glass bottles and jars, not metal cans. That detail matters. The principle came first. The container changed later. And the principle was not mysterious once you saw the effect. Heat reduced the spoilage agents inside. The seal prevented new contamination from entering. The food was, in practical terms, locked away from the air and organisms that normally destroyed it. Not forever, not perfectly, but long enough to change the economics of storage. That was the first breakthrough. Not flavor, not convenience, predictability. Because once food can be sealed and stabilized, you are no longer living harvest to harvest in the same way. You can move cooked soups, meats, vegetables, and fruits into a controlled package, hold them in inventory, and transport them later. Consumption no longer has to happen close to origin. Time stops being an immediate enemy and becomes a variable you can manage. And once that happens, food starts behaving less like a perishable event and more like shippable stock. But Appert's system was not yet the thing that changed the world. Glass was fragile.
It broke in transit. It was heavy. It was awkward under military handling. It solved preservation better than distribution, and that distinction became decisive. In 1810, an English merchant named Peter Durand received a patent connected to preserving food in containers made from tin-plated iron. Durand did not personally build the industrial canning empire that followed, but the patent marked the transition from the preservation idea to the metal package that could travel harder, stack better, and survive the abuse of transport more effectively. Soon after, figures like Brian Domkin and John Hall pushed the process into commercial production in Britain, supplying preserved food to the Royal Navy and other institutional buyers.
Now the logic hardened into something industrial. A metal canister could be packed tightly. It could survive shipboard movement. It could be loaded in bulk. It could be stacked in stores. It could endure handling by dock workers, sailors, soldiers, and quartermasters who had no reason to treat food gently. The can did not merely preserve food, it made preserved food transportable in a different class. This is where the tin can stops being packaging and starts becoming infrastructure. A can solves multiple problems at once. It encloses the food in a rigid shell. It allows heat processing after sealing. It creates a standardized unit that can be counted, inventoried, and shipped. It protects against crushing better than glass. It stacks more efficiently than irregular jars or barrels. And most importantly, it turns food into something closer to a component of logistics. 1 unit, then 100, then 10,000. The military value of that was obvious long before the household value was. Armies had always been constrained by food. Move too far from supply and the campaign slows. Depend too heavily on foraging and discipline collapses. Rely on fresh provisions and weather or delay can become strategic threats. Preserved food did not eliminate those problems, but it narrowed them. A state that could stock sealed provisions could sustain men longer, farther, and with greater planning discipline than one that still depended on a more perishable chain. The same was true at sea. Naval power depends on endurance. Ships do not project force because they float. They project force because they remain supplied. Canned provisions gave navies something better than hope and salted monotony. Not perfect food, often not even pleasant food, but edible, stable, measurable food. And in logistics, reliable and unpleasant often beats fresh and impossible. Except there was a problem. Early cans were expensive, very expensive. They were not the disposable light-gauge containers of the supermarket era. They were handmade, often thick, soldered by labor, and produced slowly. In the early 19th century, a can might be closer to a small metal box than the familiar can in a modern pantry. That meant the technology worked before it was truly scalable. And there were other frictions. The can opener did not arrive until decades later. For years, opening a can could involve a hammer, chisel, knife, bayonet, or brute force. The container had outrun its user interface. Preservation had been solved more elegantly than access. That sounds almost absurd now, but it reveals something important about industrial adoption. A system can be revolutionary in principle and still awkward in practice for a very long time. Then there was safety. Early canning was inconsistent. Process times were not fully standardized. Seals could fail. Solder could contaminate food with lead. Some products spoiled invisibly, others survived. The basic concept was sound, but the discipline underneath it still needed refinement. A clever container is not enough. The method has to be repeatable. The factory has to control temperature, sealing, sanitation, and timing well enough that the contents deserve trust. Trust became the invisible battleground, because canned food asks the buyer to accept a strange bargain. You cannot inspect the food directly. You cannot smell it at the point of purchase. You cannot touch its freshness. You are placing faith in a sealed object, a manufacturer, and a process you cannot see. That is a very modern relationship. The can helped create it. What pushed that relationship forward was not consumer romance, it was scale.
And scale came again and again through institutions that cared less about culinary beauty than operational certainty. Navies, armies, expeditions, merchant provisioning, remote labor forces, industrial employers. The can kept proving itself where reliability mattered more than sentiment. As the 19th century progressed, can manufacturing improved. Machinery reduced some of the labor intensity. Production volumes rose. Costs gradually fell. Standardization improved. Food science, though still incomplete, became more practical. Factories got better at repeatability. Railroads expanded. Steamships linked markets more tightly. Urban populations grew larger and more detached from the places where food was produced. All of those developments increased demand for a format that could survive storage and transport without collapsing into spoilage. That is when the can escaped its first role. It was no longer only for expeditionary use, naval contracts, or elite novelty. It moved into commercial food systems: fruit, fish, soups, tomatoes, condensed milk, meat products, shelf-stable meals, commodity ingredients. Suddenly, the can was not just extending food life, it was reorganizing the food economy.
That changed trade. Producers could process surpluses and ship them later. Fisheries could pack catches in a transportable form with longer selling windows. Agricultural regions could feed distant cities more consistently. Colonial trade networks could move preserved goods across oceans with less loss. Retailers could stock shelves with products that did not require immediate sale. Households could keep food in reserve. A pantry became a storage node in a larger industrial chain. And once that happened, the can began changing behavior, not just supply. Ordinary people could buy food for later rather than for today. Urban families could rely on preserved staples when fresh supply fluctuated. Seasonal scarcity softened in some categories. Emergency stockpiling became practical. Convenience, though not yet the full processed food culture of the 20th century, started taking recognizable shape. The food system had become less synchronized with harvest and more synchronized with manufacturing. War accelerated that transformation again, and more violently. By the late 19th century and into the 20th, industrial war demanded industrial feeding. Mass armies cannot operate on improvisation. They need provisioning systems that can be forecast, stored, transported, and issued in units. Canned food fit that requirement with brutal efficiency. It was durable, countable, portable, and suitable for stockpiling. In wartime, those qualities matter as much as taste, often more. From imperial campaigns to total war, the can became part of the machinery behind the front. In the First World War, and even more dramatically in the Second, preserved and canned food moved at scales that earlier generations would have struggled to imagine. Factories expanded, processes improved, governments contracted enormous output. Packaging, transport, and ration systems became tighter and more integrated. When the war ended, the production capacity, habits, and distribution logic did not disappear. They stayed. That is the pattern these ordinary industrial objects often follow. War does not always invent them. It scales them. It standardizes them. It forces them into the center of a system and then leaves that system enlarged after the fighting stops. By the mid-20th century, the tin can had become normal in a way that would have been difficult to explain to Appert. Supermarket shelves filled with soups, vegetables, fruits, fish, milk, sauces, beans, and meat products. Brands built identities around shelf stability. National distribution became routine. Consumers came to expect that food could appear far from where it was grown, outside the season in which it was harvested, and in a form already prepared for storage. Even the word tin can outlived the material with some irony. Many so-called tin cans were really steel cans coated with tin, and later other materials and processes entered the picture. But the industrial principle stayed recognizable. Seal the food, process it, standardize it, move it, store it, sell it,
trust the system. And that system is now so familiar that it almost disappears. You see a soup can and think of lunch. You see a ration tin and think of war memorabilia. You see canned tomatoes and think of a pantry staple. But those objects represent something larger than their contents. They represent the ability to detach eating from immediacy, to build reserves, to smooth scarcity, to project power, to feed cities, to turn food into inventory without turning all of it into waste. Of course, the can did not do this alone. Railroads mattered, steamships mattered, refrigeration mattered, food chemistry mattered, factory discipline mattered, retail distribution mattered. But the can was one of the key interfaces that allowed all of those systems to touch food in a usable way. It was the shell that made the promise practical. A cheap metal container did not make food. It did something more structural. It held food hold still. It held still long enough to cross oceans, long enough to survive war, long enough to sit in warehouses and on grocery shelves and in kitchen cupboards waiting for the moment somebody needed it. That is why the tin can matters. Not because it looks important, because it removed time from the transaction just enough to let modern food systems expand around it. Nicolas Appert was trying to preserve food. Peter Durand's patent helped shift that logic into metal. Manufacturers industrialized it. Militaries scaled it. Rail and ship networks distributed it. Grocery stores normalized it. And households absorbed it so completely that the object itself became invisible. But it is still there, on shelves, in supply depots, in emergency kits, in field rations, in supermarket aisles stacked with the quiet outcome of 2 centuries of preservation, standardization, and distribution. It's easy to call it packaging. It was never just packaging. It was a container that helped turn food into infrastructure.